Thank you. So I'm Paul Condon, and my colleagues Christy Wilson-Mendenhall and John Dunne will be joining. So it's really a pleasure to be here and kick off this 2 days of talks. And we're excited to share our progress that we've made with this work this year, and then also get your feedback and learn what you guys are doing. So the purpose of our project is to study self, desire, and virtue in the context of romantic relationships, with a specific eye towards what Buddhist philosophy can bring to this research area. So I'd like to start by posing the question why we would be interested in studying self, motivation, and virtue in close relationships and in romantic relationships in particular. And what I'm going to assert is that all of these variables, self, motivation, and virtue, are particularly relevant in the context of romantic relationships. So a classic principle of social psychology is that the self is socially constructed. We develop self-concepts and identities or narratives about the self based on how we perceive that others evaluate us. So from the time of infancy and childhood, we begin to develop a self-concept based on the way that our parents and caregivers perceive us, or the way that we think they perceive us. And then through childhood, through friends, and then in adulthood, at least in our culture, the iconic context in which this occurs is in romantic relationships. And the relationship scientists Harry Rees and Phil Shaver suggest that intimacy is an interpersonal process that begins with one person disclosing information about the self to another person, and the kind of information that they would only disclose to a very close or intimate partner. And then the partner provides some response to that information about the self. And this is a process in which the identities between partners become intertwined. Motivation is highly influenced by close others. So our romantic partners can be the greatest ally in supporting our desires and aspirations and goals. They help determine what goals and aspirations we choose and how successful we are in actually achieving them. It also creates or affords the opportunity for conflicting interests. In some cases, my partner's needs and goals and desires might conflict with what I want for myself. And so with the opportunity for conflict, there's also an opportunity for virtue, in which one can sacrifice one's own immediate self-interest for the benefit of another. And virtue is expressed in relations with other people. And most importantly, there's a lot of variability in relationships. So some relationships are characterized by virtue and kindness and responsiveness, whereas others are not. And our close, supportive relationships are one of the most important predictors of a person's individual physical health and well-being. But they can also be a very important predictor of distress. Toxic relationships are one of the greatest causes of stress and one of the most common, frequently presented problems in psychotherapy. So we want to capitalize on this context that is so important to so many people in their everyday lives to study the interplay of self-motivation and virtue. So in this talk, we'll give an overview of what our project actually entails. We'll talk about deep integration and how that process works for our team and how it works in particular in this study. Talk about the progress that we've made this year, and then the obstacles, or what we like to think of as challenges, and then the deliverables that we will end up with. So again, the goal of this project is to study self-motivation and virtue in the context of everyday life among romantic couples. And the current literature in relationship science suggests that flourishing in long-term relationships is characterized by virtues like caring and kindness. However, less is known about how this is actually cultivated. And what we suggest is that the Buddhist philosophy, the framework provided by Buddhist philosophy, is well positioned to provide novel contributions to the relationship literature because it emphasizes not just behaviors, but the actual psychological context in which intentions arise, intentions to benefit another, for example. So we'll talk about the Buddhist perspective of compassion and wisdom as two key virtues that are relevant to flourishing. Now, you might think that it wouldn't be that surprising for compassion and wisdom to predict flourishing in relationships. So people who are kind to each other are going to do well. But we need something more than just the ability to predict. So the noted relationship scientist John Gottman, who's famous for predicting the dissolution of marriages just based on thin slices of behavior, suggests that we need to understand what leads to conflict or what leads to flourishing, not just the ability to predict. And he says, the ability to predict the outcomes of a relationship is only the beginning of scientific knowledge. Prediction isn't the same as understanding. For example, you can't say to an unhappy couple, please have more positive emotion when you disagree. We can't just tell people to be happy. Or just laugh the next time you talk about his mother. The response you'd get is, sorry, his mother's just not that funny. So how does one create more positive affect during conflict? To accomplish goals like that, you need not just prediction, but also understanding. And for understanding, you need theory. So this is where the Buddhist philosophy comes in.
So one of the ways of thinking about how Buddhism articulates virtues is actually that they are embodied by an awakened being or a Buddha, and two key virtues of a Buddha are what are known as wisdom and compassion. Wisdom can be defined basically as this notion of seeing things as they truly are, yatha bhuta darshana. And it stands in opposition to the avidya, or the ignorance, these are Sanskrit terms, the ignorance that characterizes the lives of ordinary beings. This ignorance is what causes, the Buddhist claim is that this ignorance is what causes suffering. And the removal of ignorance, to the degree to which ignorance is being removed, that is, the degree to which wisdom is present, is an indicative of flourishing. So the more wisdom we have, the more flourishing we have, on the one hand. This ignorance in particular is focused upon primarily a delusion about the nature of identity, not just one's own identity, but also the identity of those around one. Now, wisdom is not the only virtue. There are actually many other virtues, but the second key virtue is compassion. And basically, compassion is, as it says here, engaging with the world focused entirely on relieving others' suffering and ensuring their happiness. And what's important here is that compassion is actually a kind of motivational stance. It's an intentional stance. It's an orientation toward the world. It doesn't necessarily correlate to any particular behavior. It is actually, you could say, a kind of attitude that one carries with one. So in terms of our project, there are four theoretical claims that are very important to understand how we're trying to integrate a Buddhist philosophy into social psychology around relationships. One of them is basically this idea that, in fact, drawing on the concept of what's called Tathagata Garbha, or Buddha nature, all beings already participate in some degree in the virtues of a Buddha. In other words, all beings have to some degree of compassion and wisdom. The greater degree, as I said previously, the greater the presence of these two virtues, the more there will be flourishing. And importantly, the virtuous acts are not determined just by the behavior, what the particular behaviors, but rather the intention that is driving the behavior. And of course, in this context, a maximally virtuous intention will be one that is both not deluded and also compassionate, that is to say, seeking to aid others. So the intentional stance is what really is going to constitute the flourishing, not the particular act or behavior. And also, equally importantly, wisdom and compassion must be balanced in order for flourishing to occur. For example, you could consider a context in which, and this is something that is unfortunately familiar to us in our society, an extremely compassionate person who engages in some kind of work for others, very altruistically, but then burns out. And this would be, on the Buddhist account, the result of a lack of wisdom. But the way in which that engagement is occurring is somehow diluted in terms of the capacities of that person or the context or what have you. Likewise, importantly, wisdom on its own will not actually lead to flourishing, because wisdom in a certain sense is primarily deconstructive. It is seeing through our delusions. It doesn't allow us to construct a world of interpersonal relationship. So we need both of these in order for there to be flourishing, especially in romantic relationships. Now, one of the key features that we think is important here in terms of how wisdom actually manifests is in a concept that we call dereification. This relates also to, in the literature on mindfulness, the notion of decentering. And very briefly, dereification is actually an opportunity for an individual to, in a sense, drop the story that they are currently working with and adopt a different story. So this is really primarily on the wisdom side, not on the compassion side. We think that this is one of the more important elements for perhaps, let's say, offering some challenges to the current literature on relationships and social psychology. One way of thinking about de-reification is that it simply consists of that phenomenological moment in which one experiences a thought as a thought. This occurs, for example, in the moment of a daydream. I'm on a beach in the Bahamas, it's nice and sunny, then suddenly I realize I'm listening to this talk. Now that moment in which that occurs phenomenologically is a moment in which those mental contents of the beautiful beach are observed to not be a beautiful beach, they're simply a mental event. And that turn, which requires, for example, meta-awareness, along with other factors to be in place, that moment gives one a capacity and actually really requires one to drop that story. We think that de-reification is especially important in these contexts because a lot of the issues within relationships in terms of the way they're constructed in social psychology are around the kinds of stories that we tell about our partners.
I want to now orient you to the specific aims or the actual goals of this project. The first aim is theoretical in nature. We want to integrate the Buddhist philosophy, the framework that John has just provided, with the current literature on relationships. And this will give an opportunity to show that the Buddhist framework can explain current findings, but also point out new areas, new hypotheses to help resolve current debates or questions that the current relationship literature has not addressed. And the second aim is following the wonderful presentation of experience sampling methods by Aranda this morning. We're going to use the experience sampling approach to try to assess variability between individuals and couples in terms of their virtuous states of compassion and de-reification in daily life. And we predict that we will get tremendous variability between individuals and between couples. So I don't need to say too much here, following on the heels of the earlier presentation, but our goal here is to actually measure de-reification and measures of compassion in daily life for about 10 to 12 days, and then assess that whether they're related to experiences of flourishing within the context of romantic relationships. And later on in the talk, Christy will give some details on how we are going to try to do that. The third aim is to assess whether these experiences actually predict indicators of flourishing at the level of an individual and at the level of a couple. And we're going to draw on well-established paradigms from social psychology to measure behavior and also to measure physiological indicators of flourishing. So just to give you a little preview, a few ways that we conceptualize this is looking at pro-social behavior towards partners. In the relationship literature, one of the most profound indicators of relationship satisfaction is actually how a partner responds to the positive news of another. So how a romantic partner might respond to a job promotion that their partner received. That job promotion could mean that the partner needs to spend more time away from the home life, etc. But if the person is very actively engaged and responsive to that, it's a predictor of strong relationship satisfaction. We also intend to measure pro-social behavior towards strangers and measure psychophysiology in dyadic interactions. And previous literature has shown that physiological synchrony between couples during interactions is predictive of both relationship satisfaction and relationship dissatisfaction. There's distinct indicators that show that during conversations, different measures predict different outcomes for relationships. So next, we'd like to talk about what deep integration means for our team and for this project in particular. So John, Christy, and myself all come to this project with familiarity in integrating Buddhist philosophy and science. All three of us have independently engaged in research projects at this intersection of Buddhist practice, Buddhist contemplative practices, and scientific assessment of those practices, and have been involved in various organizations or institutions that are supportive of this type of work. So I think that most importantly, when we have conversations and we engage in dialogue about Buddhist philosophy and relationship science literature, we have a shared vocabulary so we understand where each other is coming from. We also have team knowledge across disciplines and methods within psychology. So my background is as a social psychologist studying social behavior and contemplative practices to modify social behavior. Christy is classically trained as a cognitive and affective neuroscientist and has a lot of expertise in studying variability in emotional experiences in daily life. The one challenge is that we come from different institutions, so it's hard for us to get time in person to meet together, but we do travel to try to get together. And then we're also just one click away on the computer. We'll make a plug for Zoom. It's a great collaborative tool that allows teams to share documents and edit documents live during a conversation. So we found that that's been very helpful in our collaborative work. The more serious challenges are the conceptual mapping or the translation of concepts between the disciplines. So one unique challenge with this project is that the Buddhist philosophy is not really concerned or oriented around romantic relationships. The Buddhist path isn't concerned with helping your romantic relationship succeed. So this is a particularly unique issue that we're working with.
Quite the opposite, actually.
So that's one challenge that we are working with currently. Another key issue in mapping these concepts, as John was mentioning, that there are these states of wisdom and compassion that occur in sort of the ideal Buddhist context for an enlightened being, and we're working with participants who are ordinary people, so we need to translate these concepts into forms that are meaningful to people in ordinary life, as well as the challenge of measuring some of these concepts in people who aren't training in contemplative practice. So we're not at the stage where we want to develop an intervention. We want to take a basic science approach and study these processes that come from Buddhists in a basic science way, which will eventually inform contemplative-inspired interventions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christy.
Thanks. All right, can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm going to use the podium as the third speaker. Yes, so progress, the good stuff. So this is our timeline organized by aims, our 3 aims. And so we knew that deep integration was going to take some time. So we really set aside year 1 to do this theoretical integration between Buddhist philosophy and relationship science, and to really start to dig in also to our design, which is quite complex. So I'm going to give you a few examples of our progress, and I'm going to start with theoretical integration. And to organize this discussion, I'm going to use 2 kind of central questions. So in the context of understanding virtue and flourishing in relationships, how does the Buddhist notion of wisdom fit within the discourse on social construction in relationship science? And how does the Buddhist notion of compassion fit within the discourse on responsiveness in relationship science? So starting with social construction, in a social constructionist perspective, which I imagine is familiar to quite a few of you, the idea is that we actively construct our social reality. It's not a reflection or a map of the world. So the emphasis here really is on the processes by which people come to describe, explain, or otherwise account for the world. And it's assumed that people's goals and expectations shape how they construct and perceive their worlds, including perception of the self, perception of other, and perception of relationships. So where this became particularly relevant in relationship science is when they started to do initial observational studies, and they were bringing couples into the lab and observing their behavior. And they noticed actually that their perceptions, the couple's perceptions of the other, varied quite a bit from naive observers. So they were seeing their partner's behavior in a very different way than a trained naive observer. And what emerged initially was this pattern in which couples who were experiencing distress, so they were having trouble, tended to interpret their partner's behavior when it was a negative behavior in terms of stable and internal negative traits, and was a positive behavior in terms of fleeting and situational positive affect. So let me just give you an example of this to ground it out. So say Sally makes dinner and she's anticipating that Harry's gonna do the dishes. But Harry doesn't do the dishes, he goes and lays on the couch and watches TV. And so she immediately goes to these stable and kind of internal negative traits. He's inconsiderate and selfish. Alternatively, if Harry actually did go and do the dishes, she thinks, oh well, he's nice because he's been successful this week at work, it won't last, it doesn't mean much. So the positive situation here is very fleeting and situational. In contrast, what you see in couples who are functioning much better is the opposite. So in this case, if Harry doesn't do the dishes and goes and watches TV, Sally might think, oh well, he's in a bad mood. He's been under a lot of stress lately. So the attribution is about the situation. It's not assumed to be kind of stable and reoccurring. And for positively construed behaviors, so if Harry did do the dishes, Sally might think he's a considerate and loving person. That's the way he is. That's why he did that. So it's setting up this, so the theme here is really that these kind of positive, enduring qualities are what are helping to protect relationships. Yes, the perception, exactly, the perception of positive, enduring qualities. So this was further elaborated in the theory and empirical work on positive illusions in relationships. So this takes things one step further to posit that these positive qualities that people see as stable in their partner are actually qualities that their partner do not see in himself or herself, or see to a lesser degree. So it's an illusion, right? It's different from how their partner is actually seeing him or herself. They're seeing them as more positive. And the reasoning behind this is that a tight, coherent, evaluatively consistent story about one's partner prevents troubling doubts in the relationship. So this is the function that it's serving. So how does Buddhist wisdom align with this thinking on positive qualities and positive illusions? So I think there's definitely a few similarities here. So there's an emphasis on constructed nature of mental states, right? The constructed perception of the other, including perception of self, other, and the relationship. And the idea that you need these constructions, right? They're useful. You have to have them to be able to kind of interact in the world and interact with your partner. And this is true of Buddhism as well. If you're a non-Buddha, you need to have these stories to be able to interact in the world. And then John's going to kind of present how these diverge a bit.
So one of the ways in which there are some important divergences is precisely the notion that the illusion is an illusion. So it's not necessarily the case that the kind of cognitive reappraisal involved in those positive illusions is going to be set aside, but rather that one recognizes that the story, as I'll call it here, the narrative that one is producing is in fact a narrative, and that it is not fully descriptive of the reality at hand. In fact, at times, in lieu of producing more illusion, there may be occasions in a relationship in which one says, I don't know why he's not doing the dishes, right? So there isn't actually a cognitive reappraisal in that moment. This stands in contrast to the relationship science position that really what's important here is that you produce a tight, coherent story with the right kind of positive illusions that will make the relationship last. To me, of course, that sounds like a disaster. You know, a tight, coherent story. Having done a lot of philosophy, the tendency is for tight, coherent stories to fall apart over time, or at some point they're going to explode. So the Buddhist idea here is to see through the story, through using especially this capacity for dereification, which is actually what we think is an empirically measurable moment in which a perspective shift occurs. Secondly, there's also very important attention to what is observable, attention to the observable behaviors as relevant to constructing or reconstructing the story. In other words, given the fact that one already understands at some level, and this may be more implicit than explicit to the individual, it may not always be the case that they are explicitly aware that their account of the other person is an illusion, or that it is a story, so to speak, but they may be enacting that story or telling that story in a way which implies or which behaviorally in a measurable way indicates that they understand it to be illusory in some fashion. That capacity to see the story as an illusion gives it some flexibility, and therefore it's revisable. And that revisability is going to come through what the actual observation of the other's behaviors. If Harry's on the couch instead of doing the dishes, that's relevant to producing the story that's going to be best for this relationship. That's relevant to revising that story. It may also be relevant to dropping the story and inquiring, hey, what's really going on? So we think that these two aspects of Buddhism stand in strong contrast to the relationship science as it stands now in social psychology. For example, in the second point, it's really about maintaining the positive interpretations even in the face of observed problems that relationship science says is predictive of positive relationships. So these are the two ways in which Buddhism challenges some of that.
So a second major theme in relationship science is the idea or construct of responsiveness. And responsiveness is defined as the intention to understand, validate, and care for the needs and best interests of the partner. Understanding is thought of as comprehending the partner's core self, so their needs, desires, strengths, weaknesses, etc. Validation is understood as respect for or valuing the partner's view of the self. Caring is understood as expressing affection, warmth, and concern for the partner's well-being. And it's not only this intention and its expression, but it's the perception from the side of the partner of that intention as responsive. So the partner needs to perceive the expression of that intention as responsive. And this perception is a huge part of what predicts kind of positive effects in relationships. So we can ask here, how does responsiveness align with the Buddhist concept of compassion? And again, we see several similarities. So there's this intention to understand and care for the needs and best interests of the partner. There's sort of a general positive regard, warmth, and concern for the partner. And there's the idea that self-transcending is a big part of this, right? It can be costly to the self, so it's not about one's own needs. And again, though, we do see some divergences from how this is classically thought about in the psychology literature, which again, I'll bring down.
One important divergence here is actually the baseline assumption that essentialism is at the root of suffering. Essentialism, especially about identities, one's own and others' identities. And therefore, part of what that means is that this notion of the core self may not simply need to be validated, but that there are times in which that sense of oneself should be called into question, and it may be the partner's role to call it into question for the other. And that on the Buddhist standpoint, this will lead to an especially healthy relationship. And of course, part of what's implied here, it's not on the slide, but part of what's implied here is that there is a shared set of values that the relationship, that the members of the relationship hold, really a kind of set of norms about the way in which they should lead their lives, or what constitutes the good life. And that shared set of values may not always align with that core self. So that's an important possible divergence here, where the sense of a core identity and essentialized sort of enduring identity really needs to be called into question. And finally, a very interesting and important divergence is that in relationship science, generally speaking, the idea of responsiveness requires the other to recognize that one is being compassionate, for example. There's this sense in which my position is being validated, I'm being cared for, the other is really doing something for me. And if I'm the recipient, but I don't recognize that, if I'm the recipient of some kind of care from my partner, but I don't recognize that, then this is understood not to be as effective or predictive of positive relationships. But interestingly, in the Buddhist context, compassion paradigmatically does not require that the other recognize one's intention. It's simply what counts is that one has that intention. This is an important divergence. How that will actually play out in relationships will be interesting to see.
So we can ask the question, of course, is how does this theoretical integration that we've been working on inform how we approach the empirical study of relationships? And so we think there are actually several themes here that are really important and a kind of new direction in terms of thinking about the research that we should be doing to understand flourishing in relationships. So one really important theme, coming back to sort of the beginning, is the integration of compassion and wisdom together. So we just saw how wisdom in a lot of ways differs from kind of traditional thinking about interactions in relationship science, and also compassion. And I think, compassion, a lot of what's differing about compassion is what happens when you place compassion in the context of wisdom. So the two together really kind of, I think, add something new to this pursuit. And these two together, we propose or think or hypothesize could underlie the types of things that get discussed in the clinical literature, like understanding de-escalation during conflict and repair after conflict, that are really important for protecting and flourishing in relationships. A second major theme is the dynamic co-construction of the relationship. So the idea that this is at the level of the relationship itself. The relationship is going to be impermanent. It's going to change. It's not always going to be the same way as the constructions, the minds of the people in that relationship change. And so how that manifests, and particularly, what happens when this change occurs. A relationship may not always work, right? So being able to recognize, A, that it's impermanent and changing, B, when it's changing in ways that may not work, and sort of accepting that and moving on. We think this particular view kind of emphasizes this more than the typical approach of sort of fixing relationships. And the third is sort of the utility of the constructed stories and narratives about ourselves and others and about our relationship. So this idea that the constructed narrative is only really useful if it's consistent with observable behavior. Okay. Thanks. So we think what's kind of intriguing to us as well is that we think that our theoretical work thus far we've seen some interesting ways that this is integrating really new empirical findings. So this is, of course, consistent with many of the existing findings in relationship literature, but there's been some new work that we find interesting in the context of this theoretical synthesis. So in particular, new work that's kind of highlighting the dark side of positive illusions. So they seem to be beneficial in many contexts, but there's this other side, right? They have some negative consequences. One being, for example, unrealistic optimism. A second is that when you start to measure positive illusions, the impact of positive illusions in everyday life, the benefits seem to be less clear. So in one study where they measured affective responses associated with conflict, the benefit of perceiving your partner more positively than they perceive themselves wasn't very clear. And then some initial evidence for the importance of wisdom, that this may be a fruitful and productive direction for research. Some initial findings that trait mindfulness is associated with relationship satisfaction. And of course, trait mindfulness is a much more kind of comprehensive and sometimes problematic construct, but we think this is at least interesting and intriguing for this direction of research. So in the last part of this section, I'm now going to switch to aim 2 and our progress in thinking about the design and refining procedures. So our group So one of the things we bring to this project is that our group has a lot of existing methods expertise that's going to be very useful in implementing this project. So we're currently running a multimodal project with experience sampling physiology that's really geared towards individual differences, so not on relationships, but we're used to running these kind of big multi-method studies. We've been engaged in app development for experience sampling over the last few years, and we've learned a ton about kind of user interface and optimizing that, and we have a very good relationship with a company that we work for, so this makes it very easy. And to give you a sense of the benefits of this kind of technology, in a sample that we're collecting right now of 84 participants, 92% of those participants have a response rate to the alerts that they're receiving of 90% or more. So it's been really effective. And then, of course, we are, again, currently doing these kinds of psychophysiology and behavioral lab tasks. And so we're used to kind of thinking about how we can include these more implicit measures of suffering and flourishing. So as we were working through the literature on relationship science, we also were doing that with an eye for methods development. And a few kind of important themes came up for us as we were expanding on the approach that we laid out in the grant. So one is kind of the sampling approach that we're going to take. And it seems like it may be really important to actually have a somewhat hybrid approach. So, and a lot of times what the method that experience sampling uses is kind of this unpredictable random sampling to capture in the moment experience. So you're sending alerts to people throughout their day, but they don't know exactly when they're going to come. But you may miss, the issue with that is that you may miss situations, right? You may miss experiences that are actually really important. And we think this is actually really important for the study of relationships. So we will probably also have a daily diary component to capture what's been referred to as diagnostic relationships. And these are situations usually involving stress between the couple or conflicting interests. And as Paul mentioned in the beginning, these are the types of situations that present the opportunity to kind of self-transcend, to put another's needs before your own. So we want to make sure that we're capturing those kinds of situations. And then I think what's become really clear to us is that we would also like to really try to measure as much as possible these existing constructs. In a lot of that will involve actually translating them into kind of an experience sampling methodology to see how, we're thinking about de-reification and compassion, self-transcendent desire relates to these existing constructs like attributions of behavior, partner enhancement, positive illusions, and responsiveness. So just a little bit on how we're thinking about measuring these Buddhist constructs, which is certainly a challenge, and I think this is certainly a work in progress. We're just at the beginning. So we're thinking about, the way that we're thinking about de-reification is actually measuring reifying on a continuum with de-reification at one end, with the idea that as reification increases, rigidity and attachment to a mental state increases. And so the way that we're thinking, and I think as this was brought up earlier, you can't ask people if they're everyday people if they're reifying their thoughts, right? They don't really understand what that means unless you're sort of a trained meditator. So the approach that we've come up with is more of an indirect assessment. So our thinking now is that we'll ask people to self-generate thoughts. So asking a simple question like, what comes to mind when you think of your partner, yourself, the relationship? And then we'll ask a series of follow-up questions that allow us to start to get at whether they're reifying that thought. So asking them things like, how confident are you in the accuracy of that thought or perception or memory? How flexible is it? Could you take another perspective? So a series of questions that we think start to get at reifying. And this kind of open-ended approach, I wouldn't say is typical in psychology research, but we've had a lot of success using open-ended questions in our recent research. So part of what brought us to this research project is a current project we're doing in which one of the questions is an open-ended question of what did you want most? And we just ask people to respond to that. They're wanting something. So as you can see here, quite a lot of those open-ended responses have to do with relationships. And so it's really, what's really amazing, it's really rich qualitative data. So I think this is a really productive direction. So, and then finally, how are we going to measure compassion, this idea of self-transcending? So again, I just want to quickly make the point that the importance of kind of capturing daily stressful or conflict situations where we might see this more. And so again, we need to use, I think, a series of questions to get at this. And so we will ask people kind of, our current working way to do this is ask people kind of what they're wanting, what they want to feel, if that conflicts with what their partner wants and what they want to feel, and then, you know, who took priority in that conflict. Another way we have of kind of assessing this is more indirectly, is to ask people to rate their emotions that are thought to be more self-transcendent, like compassion and gratitude. And the final thing that has really come up for us as being important here that I think we didn't consider initially is trying to ask some questions about the perception of the partner's mind. So their needs, their affect, their agency, their suffering, to have a better understanding of how this is happening in the dyad. And of course, what's nice about that is if we ask those types of questions to both partners, we can calculate things like empathic accuracy. So I'm going to turn it back over to Paul to just quickly talk about obstacles and deliverables, and we will be.
Okay. So I think that we've covered our obstacles sufficiently, so I'm going to skip ahead to what we actually hope to achieve and deliver with this project. First is, and as we've reviewed, is a theoretical integration. We really want to bring the Buddhist philosophy in and identify new areas, new hypotheses, and new research directions that can benefit the relationship science literature. This will also provide a new empirical test of these Buddhist concepts. So the contemplative studies, contemplative science field, there's a lot of work looking at how contemplative practices are important for attentional and emotional and social benefits, but an actual fine-grained, detailed analysis of these mental states and concepts has not been undertaken in the past. So this will be a new research approach for this field. And it will allow us to actually understand experiences that people have, not just behaviors. So understand the virtuous or unvirtuous intentions that people have and the processes that are related. With readily available contemplative practices in society for affecting change with those experiences. So it can be a preventative approach to relationships as opposed to just a reactive approach. We believe we'll be well set up to make novel contributions to the relationship science literature. Going back to the quote from John Gottman at the beginning, we look to provide a deeper understanding of when relationships are good and when they're not just predicting the outcome, but actually understanding why. And this should have implications for many kinds of relationships. So the idea of responsiveness that Christy reviewed is not just relevant to romantic close relationships. It also predicts success in friendships, roommate pairs, patient-doctor interactions. Responsiveness between doctors and patients lowers healthcare costs. So we think that this work will be important for understanding success in a wide variety of relationships. And then finally, going forward, we hope to use this work to inspire contemplative-inspired exercises or simple interventions that can be implemented in a experience sampling type context to help people obtain more virtuous outcomes. So we'd like to thank our collaborators on this project, Lisa Feldman-Barrett and Karen Quigley and Wendy Hasenkamp, as well as everyone here for supporting this endeavor, and our home institutions. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was interested in what you would do if you are basically documenting an abusive relationship or working with someone in an abusive relationship, because often what an abused person will do is make up a story. They didn't mean it. Sure, he hit me that one time, or in your case, he didn't do the dishes that one time, but it's much more serious. Yeah. This, So I'm just wondering if there's a whole different strategy for when you encounter abusive relationships, both psychologically or physically.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think this is one place where positive illusions kind of falls apart, right? It's not good to have a positive illusion in that sort of situation. So I think we'll turn it over to John maybe to talk a little bit about kind of how compassion and de-reification would come into play, but certainly, you know, being able to deconstruct that story, right? To understand that it's not what the person is, how the person is behaving is different from your story, to allow you to make a new one, and perhaps leave the relationship.
I think in some ways it's on the same continuum. It's just an extreme case of that continuum. I don't know if it really requires an entirely different approach, but I think part of what is going on in that sort of relationship, and I'm glad to say I'm no expert in that, but having never been in one, but my impression, based on my cursory understanding of the literature, is that in that kind of relationship, it's really, as Christy just said, it's those positive illusions which are really holding fast, but it's also an inability to kind of question the core self of the other person's identity. And that capacity, I think, is also really critical, along with the idea that what compassion is about is not just sustaining that other person's core identity, who they think they are, but actually trying to move them toward a set of norms or values that are shared in that relationship. And of course, if they're not shared, then that means maybe that relationship should end, obviously. So, but I think it's on both of those dimensions, where compassion is not just about affirming the other, but it's actually about helping them remove their own suffering, recognizing their own suffering, and adopting a story, dropping stories that aren't compatible with behavior, and really trying to come up with a narrative that makes sense in terms of behavior. I will say one thing very briefly. There's a kind of baseline story in the Buddhist world that is sort of meant to apply across all contexts, and that baseline story is everyone wants to be happy, and nobody wants to suffer, and the reason they suffer and they make others suffer is they're confused. So that is a kind of baseline story that would be adopted in this sort of a context that would enable would empower a person to get out of that abusive relationship, I think.
Owen, please keep your questions short. We have quite a few people in the queue. Thank you very much.
So I just wanted to ask a question, or just maybe make a caution. So like on the second to last slide, you mentioned empirical tests of Buddhist concepts, and I really do see how the things are fitting together. But I guess I'm worried about trying to fit a conceptual scheme from one tradition onto another. And here's the simplest way to say it is simply this, that romantic relationships, both healthy and unhealthy ones in our world, have two characteristics. They're partialistic and they're sexual. Buddhist compassion is paradigmatically non-personal. I mean, it's compassion for all sentient beings, and it's not usually non-sexual. So I just think that one in particular, clearly a healthy romantic relationship as we conceive it, being partialistic, is nonetheless supposed to involve attention to the other's needs, care and compassion. But it's really care and compassion in a very different, I think, sense or location.
I'm going to disagree with you.
I knew you would. That's why I brought it up.
So thanks, Owen. So the way I'm going to disagree with you is actually that, I mean, there are kind of a variety of opinions in this matter in the Buddhist world, but I think the one that we're working off of is the notion that actually compassion, so there's great compassion, which is universal, but compassion itself is not universal. It actually starts partial, or it is partial. And the aspect of the sort of Buddha's universal compassion, or awakened beings' universal compassion that ordinary beings already have, is precisely just this urge to really sincerely wish that another be free of suffering, and to be motivated behaviorally to actually do something about that, even if it's extremely partial. So that, I think, is, even if it's just about your own future self, actually, that would even count in this context as a kind of compassion, at least for some models. So I would say that that's not such a problem, because I think to the degree to which, so we can measure that, how strong are those types of, at least we think we can measure how strong is that kind of a stance in a dyadic relationship.
I just wanted you to say that. Thank you.
Thank you. You were right. That needed to be said.
Rhonda.
So just to go back to a discussion of compassion, I'm wondering whether you could ask couples about what their goals for the relationship are, right? So Eli Finkel has written about how, like, these days people expect their romantic relationships to help them achieve their best self or the best person they can be, right? So depending on what your goals are for your relationship, that notion of compassion can be helpful, right? Like sort of speaking truth to the type of person that you are, so you can help, work on yourself, as opposed to like, you need to sort of pamper my self-esteem, or whatever it is you need to do to make me feel good. So I'm wondering whether getting information like that might be helpful.
I think, just jump in real quick, I think based on, that was a thought I had after I saw your presentation, your joint presentation actually, that inquiring about at least the explicit goals of couples would be really interesting, actually. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about kind of goals and wanting on multiple levels. So we certainly have questions about, what do you want in this moment? What is your goal in this moment? But then talking more about kind of these, more global goals as well. So kind of what they come in with in terms of their beliefs about how the relationship should be, what their goals are. I think would be fascinating data to collect. And we've definitely left some room in our lab sessions to be able to collect that kind of data as well as the experience sampling data.
Thank you. Very interesting set of talks. In a former life, I was a relationship researcher and a positive illusions researcher. So the first thing I want to say is that in an abusive relationship, that's not positive illusions. Those are usually mild. Those would be positive delusions. Big difference. But the question I have is, the standard narrative of relationships has to do with what I do for myself and what I do for you. What I do, if I'm too focused on myself, I'm selfish. And what I want to do to be a good relationship partner is to transcend that selfishness. I think there's another way to transcend selfishness or self-focus by focusing on us or we. So I think too often we fall into it's either for you or it's for me. And so what I want to suggest to you is, or ask you if you think it would be compatible with your thinking, which it seems to me it would be, that what about a focus on us? Focus on our we-ness, the shared activities we have, the things that we do together that only happen because we do them together. Whether that's sex or conversation or some kind of, or even conflict is a together thing. You can't do it by yourself. I'm just interested in whether that idea of shared goals, shared activities, we-ness is something that resonates with you, might be useful to you.
I actually am currently thinking it doesn't really appear in the way we've been talking about compassion here, and I haven't even told my colleagues this yet, but I've been thinking a lot about compassion so one of the ways of thinking about the sort of theoretical role of compassion in the Buddhist world is that wisdom basically deconstructs the world and compassion puts it back together. The sort of dysfunctional world is constructed through self-focus, and so it's all about me. It's my survival in the world. So samsara is basically survival mode, to use this technical term in Buddhism. Compassion rebuilds a world that is about us, not about you. So I do think that that's a very important idea. We haven't quite conceptualized things in those terms, so that's very helpful. I think that that's critically important to understand that compassion actually really is a kind of us stance or we stance, and not just a you stance.
If that's congenial, then let's us talk.
Okay, sounds good.
Bob, wait for the mic. We're recording. Thank you.
John, you mentioned that one way in which Buddhism differs from the ordinary psychology of relationships is that compassion doesn't require being recognized by the other. And I think that's probably true also of Christian compassion. That it's not mutual in the way that that love is. Love is reciprocal and it's back and forth. But then if that's the case, if the Buddhist is really not interested in the response, doesn't that undercut the very idea of this kind of romantic relationship, which definitely has mutuality in it, and so there's absolutely a necessity that the other recognize. And
I think that's an interesting question. I don't know if my colleagues have some thought, but what I would say is that it's not that, so especially in some ways, I'm sort of being influenced by the talk we heard earlier, but if you think of compassion as a stance, right, that even develops as a kind of trait, then it doesn't mean that, and part of its requirement is not that it be recognized by the other, but it creates a kind of context of caring in which your behaviors are regulated by that, are constructed in terms of that particular stance, right? It's kind of the underlying motivation of how I go through my day. So I don't think that means that it has to be recognized in order for it to create a context for the relationship. So the idea that what counts as a caring action has to be recognized in order for it to count as responsive, that seems to me just very problematic from the Buddhist stance, because part of the problem here is that that's not going to happen all the time, right? So we're talking, I think, more of a motivational frame in which the relationship is being interpreted and in which my behaviors or that are guiding my behaviors. It's not about a sort of particular moments in which someone is recognizing my desire to care for them. Okay, so for me, that doesn't mean that you're not in a reciprocal relationship. It's just that there's no need for that caring to be constantly recognized. Maybe that's not the best answer.